Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Steven Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice program here at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And each week for the Curatorial Roundtable, I invite a distinguished curator or institution director to speak about their practice. And today I'm happy to have Dare Turner, who I was saying earlier, her background, which is the Brooklyn Museum where she works, looks much sunnier and warmer than it is in New York actually today. So I'm going to read a short bio for Dare and then turn things over to her for about 50 minutes. At the bottom of your screen, you see the Q&A link. That's where you can pose a question or comment to Dare, which I ask that you do in the last 10 minutes. So Dare Turner is an enrolled member of the Yurok Tribe of California, an art historian, and the curator of Indigenous Art at the Brooklyn Museum. In 2024, she co-organized the museum-wide initiative titled Preoccupied, Indigenizing the Museum at the Baltimore Museum of Art, which included 9 exhibitions, interpretive interventions across the museum, a publication guided by Native methodologies, and an array of public programs. At the Brooklyn Museum, she's curated Aaniin, I See Your Light, which utilized beadwork designs by Nico Williams to transform the museum's outdoor plaza, and co-curated Towards Joy, New Frameworks for American Art, a radical reimagining of the American wing guided by Indigenous ways of knowing and Black feminist theory. Her writings have been featured in exhibition catalogs, including what I've just mentioned, Preoccupied, Indigenizing the Museum, Towards Joy, New Frameworks for American Art, as well as Into the Time Horizon, Nevada Museum of Art, Reframing the View, 19th-century American Landscapes, and Agents of Faith, Votive Objects in Time and Place. And with that, welcome, Dare.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen now.
Great.
Thank you so
Perfect.
much for inviting me. I'm really excited to share some insights into my curatorial practice and work I've done in the last few years. And I also want to address this core question I'm thinking through with my curatorial projects. Do we want to decolonize the museum or do we want to indigenize? And you heard the title of one of my programs, so I suspect you all know the answer to that. But let's think through, this basic question of why curate art? Why be a curator? And I have two rather simple answers that we can explore a little bit more in depth in this presentation. It's my core aim is to express care and to foster empathy across the board through people that are visiting the museum, scholars, workers within the museum. What does it look like to instill a sense of empathy in a time that's radically defined by a lack of empathy in our political moment? So, I want to talk about Preoccupied. I'm going to spend a lot of time focusing on this project because it was so expansive. This really kind of changed my way of working as a curator and thinking through these core ideas of how does indigeneity emerge or how can it be represented within colonial institutions like encyclopedic museums. So, as mentioned before, this was a major project at the Baltimore Museum of Art. I co-curated with the lovely Leela Grothy, who's a contemporary art curator, or was formerly. And we had the support of a curatorial fellow, Elise Boulanger, who's Osage. So it was important that we have a diverse team supporting this project from our curatorial side as well as the non-curatorial, all of the support across the museum. So let's talk about this indigenizing question. We really grappled with, before we did any sort of convenings, before we spoke with artists, before we fully executed a vision for this program, we were grappling with the question of, do we want to decolonize? Is that an appropriate term? And if not, what would a better term be? So decolonization, we all sort of objected to it within the context that we were working within. because the term literally centers the wrong audience. So, what does it mean to move away from narratives of colonization where the colonizer is held up above the indigenous people that we actually want to represent within the museum? How can we move beyond that? Or, that can happen elsewhere, but that's not what we wanted to do with this particular project. So, the term indigenizing has come up in scholarship a bunch, and we came to this idea through collaborations with artists and scholars that supported the project in the catalog writing. So, the core thing of this project that changed my way of understanding what curatorial work can be, should be, what I want to do with my career, what is encapsulated in this slide. So prior to really deeply developing the project, we had selected artists that we wanted to work with for the 9 exhibitions. The majority of those were solo shows, focusing on a contemporary artist's current practice. We did incorporate some historical Native belongings when the artist wanted that. That was not something we were foisting on people. But we wanted to really understand artist perspectives and move beyond our roles. What I want to be is a person, not a role, not just a curator. I want to be Dare, a person who has a family, who, wants to express love in all that I do, wants to protect and celebrate Native artists and make sure that they're represented in the way they want to be. So in this case, we invited all the artists that participated in these shows, either solo show artists or artists that were included in thematic shows. We invited them to gather with us in Baltimore with designers and catalog contributors that were working on the project and had already committed themselves. And we did not want this to be, a panel that felt sterile, that was just happening within the museum building. We wanted to foster more empathy and care, and for that to be clear from the get-go. So we actually rented the space, the Last Resort Artist Retreat, a dedicated artist retreat run by Derek Adams in Baltimore. And this is a house where there are bedrooms, there's an amazing kitchen, there are lots of like nooks where with seating where we can just be comfortable and visit with one another instead of being in a boardroom doing presentations and having it be this formal gathering, which none of us were really interested in. That there's a lot of space for that. There are dedicated, curatorial conferences where we can do those formal activities. There weren't as many spaces where we could just gather as a community and do things like cook together. You see on the right side. So that was a really important part of the program for me, is like gathering around food, creating food together. It just fosters a better sense of community. And when people are more comfortable, after that, we can go to the museum, we can do site visits, we can go and look at the historical collection. We're not just throwing them right into the museum straight to work and treating everyone like they're a role. So this is something I want to do for every project. We'll see if it's possible in future projects, but that was something that really changed my perspective on how curatorial work can happen. We also did a lot of other outreach and community development. We had Live Oak Consulting, an Indigenous woman-run organization. Dina Dart came and taught staff a Decolonization 101 workshop. And this was a moment where actually decolonization was an appropriate term because it helped us interrogate our roles as workers within an encyclopedic museum. And this wasn't just curatorial. This was folks in education, even finance. Like we want across the board for these issues to be shared concern and just shared definitions, shared understanding of history. And this was really critical in helping get everybody common understanding and on the same page. And another critical component was working with Indigenous community members based in Baltimore. So there is a large population of Native folks, many of which are Lumbee. And we did listening sessions with these folks And that wasn't just focused on artists. We had people that were powwow organizers, people that worked in Hopkins Indigenous public health programs, people that were educators at various colleges. We wanted a really wide array of people that participated in this project, and again, to like pop that museum bubble. If we're always going back to the same sort of professionals, we are getting the same answers. But if we ask a powwow organizer, what do you want to see at a museum? What would make you feel, your community feel celebrated? We're going to get new, interesting answers. So they were critical in helping us think through issues like programming, how to make Native communities feel celebrated and welcomed at a space that prior to my appointment as an Indigenous art curator there was no dedicated exhibition focused on Native art since like 1992. So it was a lot of time where Native folks didn't see themselves in this museum. So there was a lot of work to do around that. We had some core project goals, which I've already touched on, centering Indigenous experiences and setting aside or subordinating Western structural forms of privilege and bias. We wanted to engage multiple Native communities and departments and curatorial divisions across the museum. And we wanted to surface in a lot of areas of the museum. We did not want this to be like a one and done sort of situation. So, a part of that was 9 exhibitions that were spread out across the museum, and a lot of those were concentrated in the contemporary art wing because we heard from Native artists in these at the unconference and the listening sessions that a lot of folks are tired of like having one work of theirs be positioned in the American art galleries alongside like 19th century paintings of Indigenous people. Native artists want to be treated like non-Native artists and have shows in the contemporary wing. So that was really important to us to embrace that as a methodology. So and a yes and methodology. We had a presence in the American wing. We had a really strong presence in the contemporary wing, as well as the prints, drawings, and photograph center. So the museum footprint was wide. These are 3 of the 9 shows I'll just mention briefly. Enduring Buffalo looked at the near total systematic eradication of buffalo by white authorities in the late 19th century. And as that happened, there was an enormous ripple effect on the lifeways of Indigenous folks that relied on this as an important relative that provided shelter and food and so many implements of life. They had to adapt, and art practices adapted as well in light of those changes. Finding Home looked at the ways in which Native artists and community members defined home amidst different pressures like forced migration or seasonal migration, and forced relocation and the abduction of children into boarding schools. So that was an expansive show where we really wanted to focus on a sense of home. Then Illustrating Agency looked at the ways in which artists over the 20th and 21st centuries asserted agency in their roles. Some of the earliest work was by artists working in the 1930s to the 1950s, and were creating works for the white marketplace. And so they were really adopting themes that would sell well to this target audience. And then we also move forward into the 21st century with a work like this by Julie Buffalo Head, where she is adapting the figure on the right from a John Smith Chesapeake Bay map, one of the first white settler-made maps of our region. So it was great to grapple with that. 3 other shows, Diani Whitehawk's Bodies of Water, looked at her sculptural practice and presented carry buckets like the one seen here that push on definitions of craft and look at the ways in which craft has, that definition has weaponized is a little bit too strong of a term, but it has really limited Native artists' presentations and, understanding of Native art within museum contexts. So this was pressing back on that and situating such works as fine art. Caroline Monet, River Flows Through Bent Trees, incorporated sculptures inspired by the artist Anishinaabe wigwam traditions, as well as eel traps that were created and being revitalized within the Chesapeake Bay region. Don't Wait for Me, Just Tell Me Where You're Going was guest curated by Sky Hopinka and incorporated 5 different time-based media works by 4 different artist collectives. And it was really great to work with him on that show. Nicholas Glannon Exists in a Width of a Knife's Edge was a show of his work that incorporated multiple new commissions. That was really exciting to be able to work with him. And then Laura Ortman, Wood That Sings, and Dana Claxton Spark, we're going to look at a little bit more in depth after we talk about a few other things. So in efforts to support our or this project's presence being felt across the museum, we also commissioned audio tour tracks from community members, some of which participated in that community advisory panel, others of which were artists. And we invited those folks to pick any object in the museum where they felt like they had something interesting to say. And so this was not limited to historical Native art or the American Wing. These were things that are going to be up on the long term, and ideally, the audio tour tracks would have stayed active beyond the length of this project. And we got a beautiful publication. I got so spoiled working on this book because we got to break the mold of what is traditionally done with museum catalogs. We worked with the amazing designer Sebastian Alban and his studio Atomi to create this volume that includes essays by scholars that speak about the field in general. And as well as a comic that we commissioned in support of the show that reimagines Indiana Jones as an indigenous man, Pueblo Jones, instead of looting indigenous sites, burial sites. Pueblo Jones was actually returning cultural belongings from museums to community members. And another element of this book was newly commissioned poetry. So Hyde Erdrich was inspired by some of the works on view, some historical photography. And so she wrote a poem that reflected on that. And that was great to include as well. And woohoo, I think that it's hard sometimes to hold on to like the impact of projects. And you do something, you bring this baby into the world, and you don't know, did people read my book? Did people see this show? And I just want to hold on to that anytime you're feeling low in these sorts of like curatorial discussions. I remind myself that the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic called our book what he hopes all museum exhibition catalogs can be. So we're doing something new. I want to bring these methodologies forward into future work at the Brooklyn Museum. And let's look at a couple of shows and the work that went into them. So Dana Claxton Spark was a good example of an opportunity where we commissioned new work. So this show focused on her fireboxes, or what non-native folks would call a light box. These really beautiful backlit photographs of women positioned in studios where they were wearing regalia from their communities. She has a large headdress series. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but right there is the earliest work in her headdress series. These are generally a single figure whose faces are covered with this regalia. She had never done full body figures. So we were able to actually commission the work on the right that represents again a figure that had been in an earlier headdress piece, Sade in the center, and her 3 girls. So it was really exciting to to see Dana take on this new approach. And the women are so sensitively depicted. I think that this is a really special moment. It really inspires care. I'm thinking about all the care that she brings to working with these sitters. And we see Sade with her 2 girls, her brand new baby, or 2 big girls and her brand new baby. And I just love elements like, the skirt, the ribbon skirts, the same fabric was used to swaddle the baby in its cradle board. So there's just such love and care that goes into all of Dana's work. And we were really privileged to work with her as well. This was a moment where we brought out some historical belongings. You can see a Cheyenne or a Ute dress there. And Dana actually went through our full list of cultural belongings from the museum and identified works that she felt would be really aligned with the show that she wanted to display. Many of these works either had never been shown or were hadn't been shown in decades. There may have been in like a permanent collection gallery a long time ago, but it was time to bring them out of the vault and breathe new life into these works. And we also incorporated some of the works that you see within the fireboxes, like that piece right there. And then the other show I want to talk about in a little bit more depth is Laura Ortman, Wood That Sings. Laura Ortman's a very talented White Mountain Apache artist and violinist, musician. And this presentation focused on her work, My Soul Remainer. And we actually got to work with Laura in an unconventional way, a way I've never done before, where we actually hired her to conserve the Apache violin in the upper left there. So this was something whose strings were falling apart. It definitely was not in a place where where she wanted it to look or alongside her work. She really wanted to kind of give it some love and attention. So this is a little video of our work together. So this was just really special to work with an artist in this way. I personally didn't know anyone that has done this kind of work before, but I'm not an expert in violins and musical instruments. Our conservation team hadn't done this kind of work before, so it felt like such a good fit to invite Laura to like give this work the respect it required and the love and care that it required. This is something where we had to work closely with conservation to share why this was a good idea, why Laura was the best person to do this work. And she just really knows this field so well. You know, she was the one picking out the horsehair for restringing both the bow and the violin itself. And that's something where I wouldn't have known, where to even get horsehair. And apparently they use that on just traditional violins. So it's all a learning process, and I really benefited from the partnership we had with Laura. Okay, now let's turn to some Brooklyn Museum projects that both happened in 2024. So that was a show, that was a year with 11 shows happening. Sorry, we have a cat that wants to join us. So yes, it was a big 2024 was a bananas year. Don't ever do what I did. That was far too much, too many projects, but I'm glad I made it through. So this was the first show I opened at the Brooklyn Museum, Nico Williams, Aaniin, I See Your Light. Nico is known for his beadwork. He's an incredibly talented Anishinaabe beadworker with a deep studio practice, and he has done public art before and was sort of experimenting with deepening that practice. So we invited him to create work for our stoop. And we wanted to do something new in the stoop that had never been done before. Oh my gosh, my cat's going crazy. And so we introduced a sculptural element to this presentation. So I'll talk a little bit about this beadwork here first. So that's not literal beads, but it is a photograph of actual beadwork that he created in his studio. And you see the pieces here that were photographed. And you see the inspiration here. So, as a part of Nico's site visit, he came out to the museum and I pulled together a bunch of different Anishinaabe historical belongings, saying, do you want to see what we have? It's not mandatory that you create work inspired by these, but I just want you to know what is available to you. And I had pulled out, I was really excited about this particular legging because it blends ribbon work, interesting beadwork, and it just is, the colors are amazing. And it's a bit unusual for Anishinaabe designs to incorporate all these different elements. So it was something that really spoke to him. And you can actually see the ribbon work pattern is the pattern that he drew into his original designs that then overlaid more traditional Anishinaabe beadwork patterns on top. So we can see that all here, much larger scale. And then the other element he felt was important to include, we wanted to include sculpture. There were extreme limitations on how that could be installed. We couldn't drill anything, we couldn't glue anything, it couldn't impede the stairs, it couldn't, make any sort of long-term impact on the stone. So we had a lot of kind of many considerations to work through, and ultimately we landed on creating these large-scale jingles that are reminiscent of jingles that are found on dresses that Anishinaabe women wear and members of other indigenous communities. And those are typically worn most commonly in powwow settings, and there are competitions where Indigenous women wear these dresses and dance, and it's so beautiful to hear the sound that the dress makes and to watch the movement. And that's something that Nico grew up around. His cousin was an acclaimed powwow competitor, won awards for her jingle dress dancing. And so that was something that he wanted to bring into the installation here. And this was something where folks could interact with it. You could play the music of the jingles by gently swaying them back and forth. We also used the special automotive paint. So sometimes of day they looked purple, other times of day they looked gold. And we did this embossed pattern on it that was inspired by a sugar mold pattern. So this is an Anishinaabe sugar mold, which was used by community members. They would pour maple syrup into these molds and let it cool, maybe in the snow, and then pop out these beautiful pucks of sugar. So this is something that, to my knowledge, and according to the database, had never been put on view. And I understand why, because there are actually drip marks. You can see those here. So it had like a storied history evident on the object, and that moves it into sort of a different space than a lot of curators have explored in the past. But to me, this was a major asset of the piece because we can understand how it was used, how it was loved, its life before it came to the museum. And that's something that really resonated with Nico as well. So there we see it again. And then the other major exhibition I've worked on at the museum is a complete reinstallation of the American Wing. 8 different galleries are organized around 8 separate frameworks. This was a very vast co-curatorial project. Curators from the American Art Department of Painting and Sculpture, Ancient Americas, Indigenous Art, Decorative Arts, Contemporary Art, Feminist Art, all came together to present different ideas organized around Indigenous ways of knowing and Black feminist theory. So this is a sample of 2 installations here. On the left, we see a framework that addresses water, trouble the water, and this is thinking through the way in which water can be a connection between different cultures. This is something where there are a lot of different works in the collection that speak to this framework. And, I had 6 weeks to pull together a checklist of dozens of objects to present within these galleries, which is not enough time. But luckily, I had some great colleagues that had put together lists for me to consider. I went through the database. I spent a lot of time in storage to revise the list, incorporate new works, swap out works, and really try to up the representation of Native art within the frameworks where it really aligned with the ideas being discussed. So Trouble the Water is a major one. To Give Flowers is another major area where there's lots of native artworks that incorporate floral imagery. So these were areas where we really increased the presentation. And the Haudenosaunee bag you see in front of this Niagara Falls painting was one of my favorite additions to the checklist because it interrupts the way we experience Niagara Falls. The painting behind is settler made. There is a sound bar above where you can hear the falls, but I wanted to interrupt that really core sightline and center and foreground Indigenous art practices. These sorts of beaded bags were created by Haudenosaunee women and sold at sites like Niagara Falls. And a lot of times, museums don't put these sorts of works on view as much because they're called tourist art. But just because they were made for an external market doesn't like decrease their importance. These are really important works that illustrate cultural sovereignty and adaptation over time. Then the gallery that most closely aligns with Indigenous ways of knowing, there are two major core themes in this space, is a gallery dedicated to radical care. So as I talked about at the beginning, we are thinking about care in terms of, yes, the objects. We want to make sure all of our beautiful things are taken care of. But we also want to make sure that we care for audiences. So when, in my mind, all audiences, but particularly Indigenous people, when they come into the museum, I want them to feel comfortable, celebrated, that their art is presented in a respectful and innovative way. And that really that we tried to forcefully hit that theme within this gallery. So we see works here that speak to the concept of rematriation. So some of you may know the term repatriation, which means sending cultural belongings back to source communities. But rematriation is a different concept. This is something where it can be defined in a lot of different ways. And within the context of the museum, we're thinking along two major definitions. First, we're thinking about the ways Indigenous community members cared for non-human relatives and fostered positive relationships where they could care for the environment and the environment cared for them. And that's really spoken to by these historical baskets in the left image. These are made by different Indigenous women from across what is now the United States and Canada, and illustrate the ways in which those women were working with the elements from their natural environment, the landscape that they had lived in for years and years, and they celebrated both the plant life, the plant relatives that made these works possible, as well as the community members who then went on to use them. And then on the right, we see Carolyn Marthley's Douglas's Gathering of Nations basket. And this really speaks to rematriation along a different definition that we're exploring in the galleries. We're thinking about the ways in which Indigenous women are carriers of culture. So a lot of people don't know that up to 90% of historical collection objects that are Indigenous historical collection objects 90% of those were made by women. And that's something that's not talked about that much in the field. It's increasingly getting attention. But I think a lot of museum visitors don't understand that when they come to the museum. This is not something that they would expect. So Carol's work speaks to that and the ways in which the women are sensitively depicted on this. Each woman comes from a different tribal nation. She's wearing regalia from her community and holding a miniature woven basket that's woven in the style of the community, which is really special. Miniatures are extremely difficult to make, so we're happy that we can bring this work into the galleries and celebrate her artistic innovations. And then the other major theme we take up in this gallery is thinking about giving thanks and gratitude. So we have presented a large-scale installation of the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving Address, Greetings to the Natural World. These are called also the words that come before all else by a lot of Haudenosaunee community members. This is a way to express gratitude for the different relatives and entities in life that make our experiences and our lives possible. So this was something where I wanted to also contextualize Haudenosaunee belongings within this sort of like rainbow around it. So we have Hayden Haynes and Samantha Jacobs bag New Beginnings there that incorporates traditional techniques. And it brings a modern understanding to them. And we paired those alongside some 19th century moccasins, which are super cool because actually, if you flip the shoes up, we can see the footprints of the people that are, or the man that originally wore them. So we really liked this dialogue between the historical and the contemporary. This is something that Hayden and Samantha were both excited about because we see motifs mirrored across both works. We see materials used in both. So it's just a really great generative dialogue. And then on the image on the left, we see the American art study. So within this space, within all of the galleries, we are really trying to foreground joy. We don't want this to be a space where we always feel the heavy narratives of trauma that a lot of different museums talk about. Those are important historical points of reference. A lot of artists take those topics up in their work. But I don't want that to be the only way of understanding Native art. It's just like decolonization. I don't want everything to be about colonization and trauma. However, we need to do a careful balance where we're not totally setting aside those narratives. But so we created this American art study as a sort of opt-in experience. Within, we have access, or we put a little QR code that offers up links to syllabi from different scholars taking up issues that are discussed in the gallery. Philip Deloria's syllabus for a class he's teaching at Harvard is in there. And then we also position works like, a Remington painting of an indigenous warrior, the last of his race, quote unquote. We position this alongside native cultural belongings to recontextualize and like encourage people to understand that there are narratives beyond the last of their race, the last of their kind. Were indigenous communities at the time of the painting and today that are vibrant, have really deep artistic practices, and we're not the last of our kind. There's lots of us. And around the edges of the American art study, you get to see some of our reading materials. So what we referenced in thinking through our exhibitions, the resources we drew upon, and they relate to both different works in the gallery. And sometimes it's just Indigenous art theory, something that I'm thinking on the back of my head that informs the way I approach curatorial work, but wasn't so on the nose connected to a particular object within the show. So we liked that opportunity to give folks an opt-in experience. If you want to read about Remington and sort of understand the problematic nature of this image, you can. We got longer word counts for this space, which is always exciting, so we can go a bit deeper. And this was a place of deep curatorial collaboration where, I was working alongside paintings curators to talk about that Remington in a different way than we had previously. And then, like I would say, I was saying yesterday in a talk, I think 90% of what I do is not gallery. That's maybe a little bit overshooting, but a lot of what I do is collection care. A lot is emails, a lot is sort of coordination across different museum departments and working with Indigenous community members. So this peyote gourd, not rattle, that we see here, was a work that some Osage community members and cultural leaders visited when I first came to the museum. This was something that they had a personal connection to, and I shared our database information about it, when it was made, what the materials are, what we were calling it, and they immediately clocked the problematic nature of this term rattle. To them and to me, this has like a sort of infantilizing quality. A lot of people, when they hear rattle, they think of babies, and that's not what this work is. That's not what community members would call it, and if it were being used today. Instead, they asked us to retitle it as a gourd. That recontextualizes the work along different lines that are more aligned with Indigenous understandings of these sort of cultural belongings. So this is a lot of what I do is collection care, going into storage, making sure that these objects are, stored in a way that is in alignment with community preferences and accessible and discoverable. It's very important to me that these works, when culturally appropriate, are on our database online. So when an Osage person looks up stuff, they can find what we care for at the museum. The exception to that rule is if something falls into a category that would be repatriatable according to a federal law called Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. So if anything falls into the NAGPRA categories, it is not on our website at the request of different Indigenous communities. Maybe it's something they don't want to repatriate right this minute, but they will pursue for repatriation in future years. So we just want to be respectful of those cultural protocols, but not use this federal legislation as a rationale to hide everything. It really needs to be discoverable. And some other collection work I have done, speaking of repatriation, this is a repatriation ceremony in which this Gitga'athla community came and accepted this gambling mat here and gambling sticks that were made by or associated with a very important Gitga'athla Chief Sheikhs, who ensured the continuity of their culture in the 19th century in a time of extremely problematic colonial engagements in which Indigenous folks were understood as a problem and something to be eradicated or transformed into settler ideologies. So here we see also a gift that was given in exchange for the work when we repatriated it. So this was our only Gitga'athla artwork within the museum that was and we were repatriating it, but the community did not want their representation to just completely disappear from the museum. So they commissioned an artist to create a new gambling mat that takes the form of the old one. And this is something that's currently on view in an exhibition that speaks about the history of the Brooklyn Museum's collection. And then what's next? On a final note, and I'm almost perfect on time, we are preparing a Hopi Kachina doll exhibition, Blessings for a Balanced World. That curatorial project is led by the Nancy Rossoff and Colleen Lucero, who's a Hopi guest curator. And this show really looks at the Kachina doll tradition in a new way. So there are many, many exhibitions of Kachina dolls that have happened. But in consulting with Hopi community members and the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, which is a tribal authority on these sorts of issues, we heard from them that shows to date have focused on culturally inappropriate material or content. So shows that discuss issues like who carved these, what are the design patterns, what are these sort of the sensitive content represented with these dolls. Those were not approved and not acceptable according to Hopi cultural protocols. So the consultants we worked with said, what we really want to see is a show focused on the women and girls who are the sole recipients of these Kachina dolls. These are given from the Katsina spirits to girls from their infancy up to their womanhood. And they are really beautiful gifts that speak to that girl's personality in the moment, where the Katsina spirits or the ways in which they hope these girls will develop. And this show includes an important 19th century collection. We had in the early 1900s, a curator of ethnology was the sort of founding member of what's now become my department. And he would go on Stuart Cullen would go on these giant collecting expeditions where he would go to different regions, California, the Southwest, to Hopi lands, and buy enormous quantities of native artworks because he was fearful that these cultures were dying out. And that was a prevailing theory at the time in which he was working. Um, so we have many, many Kachina dolls, and what's special about our collection is these dolls actually show the signs of a well-loved life. So flat dolls are given to infants, and on a few of our flat dolls, we can actually see teething marks. And that's something where a lot of other museum collections don't have these sorts of dolls that had this life within the community. A lot of other institutions have collected dolls that were made for the art market or TU. So we're excited to bring these forward, and we also want to position these folks. This is a contemporary practice as well, so we include contemporary photography, like the work we see on the right there or the left. That's a girl receiving a Kachina doll at this important moment in her life. And we also include works by contemporary makers, who are women artists that are innovating within the field and carrying on long-standing artistic traditions. So we hope that this is a balanced, exciting presentation that will bring some of the historical belongings that maybe have never been on view, like the flat dolls that show teething marks, and bring them into a new context and situate them as these treasures that are held within our museum. So that I think is it for my presentation. I'm going to stop my share and
Okay. Thank you,
um,
Dara.
yeah.
Um, there is one question so far. I have one too. So an anonymous attendee writes, "Thank you. I wondered if you see a difference between consulting and collaboration with Indigenous communities and individuals. Is there a difference to you and your work?"
Yeah, I mean, I think collaboration is a lot deeper than consulting. So a criticism that comes up a lot in the field is museums will consult and then do what they want. So consulting is not like a binding agreement the same way that collaboration is. Collaboration gives the collaborators much more agency in the development of exhibitions. I think in terms of collection management, consulting is a completely appropriate term. When we bring in Indigenous community members, invite them in when they request to come to the museum and consult on collection care, they may offer guidance in terms of like, please store it with these kinds of belongings or in this sort of box, or make sure that it's being cared for in this particular way. And consultation there has a different sort of resonance that it is collaborative in a way because they are guiding, but the terminology that is used is typically consultation, and that's even the terminology used by the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Consultation is core to being in compliance with that law and just being an ethical institution. And that law mandates that that you make collections available, you do consultations if you are a federal or an institution that receives any federal funds. So if you get $1 and you aren't a Smithsonian, which has a different set of rules, then you must do these sorts of consultations and community development work.
Okay. Um, Savona Bailey McLean writes, "I have a comment. Thank you for moving past trauma and decolonization. Those in oppressed cultures know the trauma, but need to move forward for our benefit and to capture beautiful traditions. Thanks."
Yeah, I'm glad that resonated with you. It's something that I hear a lot in the field, and it feels important to embrace that.
And Nicholas Toulouse writes, "There's a very clear distinction in identity politics from the 80s, still now, to be an Indigenous artist. Often the art world presents the distinction of indigenous, in quotation marks, to promote the artist. So will there ever be a sort of melting pot in museums while contextualizing and recontextualizing objects appropriately? And what are the problems you've discovered with categories as compared with, say, dialectic or shared themes moving forward between colonizers and indigenous folks?"
Ooh, there's a lot to unpack there. So often the art world presents a distinction of indigenous to promote the artist. This is something I think a criticism in the field in general within the context of, gallery representation. This is something that's increasingly happened over the last few years when your indigenous identity was like a selling point. It had not always been that way, as I'm sure you all know. So will there ever be a melting pot in museums while contextualizing and recontextualizing appropriately? I mean, I think that bringing together various different collections and cultural representation within the gallery maybe is an example of melting pot. I don't know that I'm totally understanding the way that you're defining that term. But I think that there are many Indigenous stories that can be told. Some of those center the colonizers, others don't. And just like the same sort of presentation can happen for decorative arts objects or craft or American painting and sculpture. So I think bringing dialogues together in the way that we did in Towards Joy maybe represents a little bit of what you're talking about. I hope I understood that correctly, but follow up in the chat if not.
Sorry, several other things. So Renee MG says, FYI, in Victoria, Australia, collaboration is required by law. My friend Christian Scheidemann writes, in which way does the concept of Western museums conflict with the life of the object in your practice?
Yeah, many ways. So a good example is museums and encyclopedic institutions in general, where they're doing these massive collecting expeditions in the 19th century, were extremely focused on preservation. So they were thinking, Stuart Cullen talked about, in these comprehensive diaries where he logged his activities on these collecting expeditions, he talked about the vanishing race. We see that a lot in 19th century paintings, for instance. And I think that the collecting strategy of that time period is extremely out of alignment with my practices, with modern collecting practices. Stuart Cullen, when he would make purchases, sometimes when he would ship things back to Brooklyn, he would say, "Oh, I got 20,000 pounds of items instead of this actual number of items." So there are newspapers that speak about that. That's extremely in conflict with Indigenous practices within museums. And another example would be, this focus on preservation we see in a lot of museum presentations, not always, and collections care is often not aligned with Indigenous like priorities. So a lot of the items that we care for were made to be used, were made to be worn, were made to have a life in the sun and be, experience light. But things like, light accumulation, is something we consider in terms of a conservation angle. And there's a lot of efforts to sort of hold an object in a static state, make sure that it doesn't change over time, when that maybe is out of alignment with how the source communities would like these objects to be in the world. So I hope that's a helpful illustration.
Next, an anonymous attendee, thanks for this illuminating presentation. Can you say a bit more about the beliefs regarding not describing the maker and other aspects of Kachina dolls?
Yeah, so this is something, this is a cultural practice that focuses on children a lot. These are critical moments in a child's life. They'll receive the Kachina dolls, and what they're told is these are gifts from the Katsinam spirits, not, so and so carved this and made this for you. There are some that are in the art market, it's understood, but within the cultural use sphere, it's really important to respect that belief. And a lot of museums have not done that. I've heard examples of Hopi school children taking a bus to X museum and the museum workers running through with like paper to cover up labels. That to me is like really sad, and we don't want to do anything like that. So by situating these within their cultural context, by ensuring that Hopi community members are writing labels and being paid, consulting with us, approving the content that we put in the galleries, we are making sure that we don't undermine cultural beliefs.
Okay, there are quite a few more, so
Woo!
bear with us. Okay, another anonymous attendee. There is a lot of Indigenous work that incorporates geometric abstraction. I'm thinking about Diane White Hawk, for example, From a Western art historical perspective, this could be read as a mere pattern. How do you explain the significance of geometric abstraction to people who don't necessarily see it as having meaning?
I think so. Diani's show, we leaned on her a lot to help us situate and communicate what is culturally appropriate about these patterns. So, in the case of Lakota beadwork, a Lakota artist practicing beadwork today can read a pattern. We've had at Baltimore, we also worked with the artist Jessa Ray Growing Thunder to interpret some tobacco bags. And she was able to tell us the whole story of, the person that used this bag had these experiences, and that's why we're seeing it in the beadwork on this bag. So, where appropriate, we're happy to speak about those motifs, to speak about, that hourglass figure represents the world above being mirrored in the world below. And that's something Diani wanted to talk about. So I think we can unpack that in labels, but it's also okay to just have a sort of sensory experience and take in these patterns as abstraction where you don't need to read the particular narratives into it.
All right. Next, Emily Butler. This was a beautiful presentation. Thank you. I'm curious if you feel from your experience of showing artists from across current political borders, whether there are similar challenges operating as a curator of Indigenous art in the US compared to Canada.
Yes, I think there are a lot of shared concerns. There are different structural things going on. Canada, has different, federal programs that are reckoning with the past. There's, I forget the title. It's something reconciliation with Indigenous folks. That's actually a program led by government. I don't know that much about it because I'm working within the context of the United States and really need to make sure I'm in compliance with our federal laws. And it's interesting to hear perspectives from Canadian curators. We have a lot of shared concerns, but the understanding of indigeneity is a little bit different up there. We have federally recognized tribes. They also have tribes that have those sort of governmental authorities, but the ways in which institutions interact with those tribes is different. There are different sort of principles. And in some ways, Canada is way ahead of us. They were doing things like, land acknowledgements, which I have mixed opinions on, but they were doing that years ahead of us, working with tribes in a much more concerted way. But they don't have things like NAGPRA, where the tribes have an authorized route to request and to force the repatriation of belongings that should not be in museums. So there are pros and cons to working in both spaces, and there are many shared concerns.
Okay, thank you for that. Gina Saboam writes, great presentation there. So glad you were able to present so many wonderful exhibitions in 2024. My question, as a highly sensitive non-Indigenous artist and consciousness creator, is about how I can best bring Indigenous sensitivity to my own practice. Is there something you hope non-Indigenous contemporary artists bring or do within our practices to help rather than hurt within museums or gallery spaces?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I don't know that I can like come up with a list of responses to that. I think if you want to address Indigenous concerns, it's extremely important to partner either with Indigenous artists or consultants or people that have an actual stake, a personal stake within the sort of subject matter you want to explore. But I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. This can be something that's explored in your own way with your own community contacts and context. So certain things might be appropriate for a gallery that don't make sense for an encyclopedic museum. And something dorky that I say whenever I give these presentations is a lot of curatorial work, and maybe the work of an artist, I'm not an artist, so I can't say, is built around friendships and trust. So it's very important that I build positive relationships and ideally friendships with artists when I want to work with them on these major shows, because that builds trust and goodwill and mutual understanding, and an openness and responsiveness to feedback. And I think that some of those lessons could also carry over to art practices.
Hmm. Okay. George Sissel writes, has either museum developed a program or system that sustains their relationships with their Indigenous communities after the exhibits end?
I can't really speak to Baltimore because I ended up taking on the Brooklyn job in the middle of that project. The entire project was Preoccupied was conceived with this long-term goal in mind, where yes, we have a presentation within the galleries of these particular shows, but the audio tracks could live on. That's something that's not time limited. We wanted to bring in Indigenous folks into um, different institutional groups like collections committees. It was important when we're considering acquisitions. I want Indigenous folks at the table giving feedback, pressure testing things, advocating for things, and putting these individuals within systems that already exist and are already like authorities on these major decisions is better in my mind than inventing new organizations or consulting groups that would sunset at the end of projects. So I think as much as possible, really helping Indigenous presence exist within existing structures is very important and a good way to ensure that we have a sustained relationship with community members after a project ends.
All right, just three more. Evans B. I'm a curator at a small museum in Western New York, and I mostly just want to thank you for opening my mind to new ideas today. I'm excited about trying to indigenize my space, but still have a lot to figure out how to do that to make sure artists are being celebrated as contemporary artists and not only as indigenous artists. It is tricky, but your talk was helpful.
Thanks,
Next,
Ben.
Gia Del Pino. At the institution where I previously worked, there was a collaboratively curated exhibition that centered Indigenous photographers. For the first time in the institution's history, translated labels featured native languages, in this case, Tohono O'odham. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. This simple but transformational addition resonated deeply with the O'odham visitors who shared that for the first time they felt seen and recognized by the institution. Could you share more about the use of language in interpretive materials?
So this is something we're exploring at the Brooklyn Museum for the Hopi show. So we have so many different consultants and partners that are supporting that show that come from the community where we're working with a Hopi graphic designer to make our book. We have co-curators and consultants, and one of the consultants is a language specialist who will be writing or translating select labels into the Hopi language, and those will be presented in the gallery. And then after the gallery presentation, that content will then be given to the Hopi Vewa Cultural Center, that's run by the Hopi guest co-curator and ensures that these sort of like cultural, these exhibitions that have focused on their culture endure. We want to have a lasting impact, and that's a good thing about publications, is they will live on beyond the timeline of the project. Thank you for bringing that up.
Last, um, and this is more of a comment, I guess. I think there's a problem with the seeking of melting pot as it could be interpreted as a way of erasing histories of the indigenous First Nations of the world until there's a change across mainstream culture. I would think you should be wary of erasing the works of indigenous people back into the storeroom of otherness. And then I think your work is very inspiring. Thank you for this talk and teaching us, and this is a bit garbled, teaching us how translations that presume status.
Thank you. Yeah, melting pot is not a term that I've used, but I know it came up in an earlier question. So thanks for adding your perspective on that.
Um, I think we're running over. There are two more
Fast
short things.
questions.
Right. Thank
Yeah.
you for the time and for sharing your knowledge. Can you repeat how you worked to produce the Preoccupied book? Or,
It was
sorry, who
with,
you worked with to produce
yeah,
the Preoccupied book?
Otomi, Otomi Studios, run by Sebastian Aban. There are many
Um,
cool Indigenous designers, though. So we're working with Lightning Kev right now, who's a Hopi designer on our current book.
and last, when will the Hopi show take place? How long will it be on view?
It opens in October, and I believe, I don't know what the closing date is. I want to say it's a 5-month run. So come in October, come in next fall and winter.
But come before that.
Yeah. As well.
Right.
See Towards Joy before that.
Okay, so those are the questions. Thanks so much, Dare. Thanks to the audience. We will not be on next week. It's spring break at SVA. The next roundtable is on March 11th with the Milan duo Francesco Urbano Ragazzi. So join us then, and Dare, I'll see you on the student link shortly. Thanks
Thank
to
you,
all.
everybody. Bye-bye.